In this next set of slides, we'll discuss positioning elements. We'll discuss the position property and various techniques for positioning elements using CSS, and we'll also talk about the z-index property, which will allow us to create depth by layering elements and overlapping them one on top of the other. In CSS, the position property can be set to relative, absolute, or fixed. For example, if we have a div and we give it the class of box, by changing its position to relative, we're able to then specify top, bottom, left, or right properties where we can give it a value of the number of pixels we would like to push it or move it relative to its initial position. Here you can see a gray box indicating a parent element, and inside of it we've created an element with a class of box that has a purple background. Now here we've set its top position to 25 pixels and its left position to 200 pixels. So what that's doing is it's pushing down on the top of the element 25 pixels, and it's pushing on the left of the element 200 pixels. So when using relative positioning, if you specify top, bottom, left, or right properties, you're able to push on the edge of that element and reposition it relative to where it was initially on the page. We can also set the position property to absolute. Now the difference here is that when setting the top, bottom, left, or right properties, we're now giving it values that are in relationship to the entire browser window. So here if we set the positioning of this box to top 0, right 0, it's going to move that box into the top right corner of the browser window. We can also set the position property to fixed. Now fixed behaves the same as absolute positioning, however, it will stay fixed in place even when the user scrolls the browser window. Next, let's take a look at a simple code example that's demonstrating different positioning. So here I've created 4 sections, and inside of them they each have a div. And here in the CSS I've given some default styling to all divs and sections. Let's first take a look at this turtle element that's positioned inside of the sewer section. Next, we'll uncomment this code here within the ID of turtle. You can see that we've set its position property to relative. This allows us to then specify top, bottom, left, or right properties to position this element. Now the top, bottom, left, or right properties accept values as pixels, percents, ems, points, among others. Here we're setting the top positioning of turtle to 20 pixels and the left positioning to 50 pixels. Let's click run to see this change. So you can see what happened here is when we set top positioning to 20 pixels, it's as if an imaginary finger is pushing down on the top of this element and it's moving it down 20 pixels. And when we set left to 50 pixels, it's as if we're pushing on the left-hand side of this element and moving it over 50 pixels. So relative positioning is moving this turtle div in relationship to where it was before. Next, let's move on to the Daily Planet section with a div with the ID of Clark inside. Here we're going to set Clark to position absolute, and we're going to give it a top 0 and a right 0 command. Now you'll see what happened was when we set this element to position absolute, top 0 and right 0 is referring to the top right corner of the browser window. In fact, if we set it to top 20 pixels, it's going to move Superman 20 pixels down from the top of the screen. Or if we say right 30 pixels, it's going to move Superman here 30 pixels from the edge of this frame here, or in other words, the entire browser window. So when you set something to position relative, top, left, bottom, or right properties are then referring to the element's position relative to where it was initially, whereas position absolute, top, right, bottom, and left properties are referring to the position of the element within the entire browser window. We'll just set these back to 0. Next, let's see what happens if we have an absolutely positioned element that's inside of a relative parent. So in this case, Lex Luthor is set to position relative. So here's Lex Luthor. And then as we remember, Clark is set to position absolute. So previously here, Superman was inside of the Daily Planet, which is statically positioned, right? We didn't set any special positioning for the Daily Planet. So here, Clark is position absolute, and he's able to break out of that element and fly to the upper right corner of the screen. However, when we place Superman inside of an element like Lex Luthor that is actually still position relative, what happens is the top right positioning now is now referring to the top right positioning of the relative parent. So what we're seeing is if an absolutely positioned element is not inside of a specially positioned parent, for example, if it's just a regular parent that's positioned static by default, it's going to break free from that element, and its top right, bottom, and left properties are going to refer to the top right and bottom left edges of the browser window. However, if that same absolutely positioned element is inside of a specially positioned parent, for example, position relative, then those same top, right, bottom, and left properties are referring to the edges of that parent element. Lastly, in the section Daily Bugle, we have another div inside of it with the ID of Peter. Now here we've set Peter to position fixed, top 0 and right 120 pixels. Now, fixed positioning behaves just the same as absolute positioning, and we can see then that Spider-Man here jumps to the top 0, which means 0 pixels from the top of this frame, or in other words, browser window. And right 120 pixels means 120 pixels from the right edge of this frame or this browser window. Now, one subtle difference between fixed positioning and absolute positioning is that when we scroll down in the browser to see the rest of the content, you'll notice that Spider-Man stays fixed in place, whereas Superman, who's only absolutely positioned, is going to scroll off the screen there.